Hi everybody, I am Reverend Rich and I'm coming to you from St Peter's Church in Kinver, which is the church high on top of the hill that you might be able to see from your school, or some of you might be able to see from your houses. And I've come here today to tell you a story, and it's a really important story for Christians. It's the Easter story. Now, Easter is the most important time of the year for Christians, even more important than Christmas. And we all know how important Christmas is, but Easter is even more important. So I'm going to tell you the Easter story. And to help me tell the story, I'm going to use this. Does anybody know what this is? This is a coconut. A coconut. It's an empty coconut. I've eaten all the stuff from inside it. But I'm going to use this to tell you the Easter story, if that's okay. And the Easter story begins on a day that we call Palm Sunday. And we'll understand in a minute why it's called Palm Sunday. And on Palm Sunday, Jesus made his way to a city called Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was the capital city of the country called Israel. And so that's a bit like London is for us. And cities in those days, they had a big wall around the outside. You might have done some studies about cities in the olden days. And they had a wall around the outside, and in the wall there were some gates. And Jesus came to Jerusalem to celebrate with his friends a festival called the Passover. And as they were coming into the city, lots of people had heard about Jesus because he'd been going around doing some amazing things, teaching, telling some brilliant stories and doing some miracles, some really surprising things. And so lots of people wanted to see Jesus. And so as he made his way into the city, a big crowd gathered. And Jesus decided he didn't want to walk into the city. He wanted to ride into the city, but he didn't ride on a big horse or in a chariot like a king or a ruler would. He decided to ride on a little baby donkey. That's a bit like a baby donkey would sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. So he rode into the city on a donkey. And this was a bit surprising because they were expecting him to come in like a king or a hero. But he rode on a donkey through the crowds, and the crowds cheered, and they put their coats on the ground in front of him, and they cut branches off the trees, and they were palm trees, and they cut branches off the trees and they waved them to give Jesus some shade and a bit of a breeze. And that's why we call it Palm Sunday, because the crowds were cheering and cheering and cheering. But some people weren't so impressed with all of this cheering and all of this commotion. They didn't like the fact that the people were treating Jesus as a hero. And so they started to plot against him. And we'll hear a bit more about that plot as the week goes on. So anyway, Jesus came into the city of Jerusalem, and he went around for a few days talking to people and teaching people and staying with his friends and doing some interesting things. And then on the Thursday of that week, so a few days after the Palm Sunday, he got all of his friends together for a very special meal. And as they were gathering for the meal, Jesus got a bowl of water and he got a cloth. And he went up to his friends and he knelt down on the floor and he started washing their feet. Now, if you can imagine, they lived in quite a sort of dusty, sandy place, and they all wore sandals. They didn't have socks and wellies and things like we do. So their feet would have been pretty disgusting, I would imagine. I certainly wouldn't fancy washing them myself, but Jesus did. He knelt down on the floor and he washed their feet clean to show that he wasn't any ordinary king, but actually he was willing to get dirty to help other people. I wonder if there are people who you can think of who are like that, who care for other people, maybe people who care for you, maybe parents who give you a bath and clean all the grub off your feet or off your faces or your hands after a mealtime. There are people who care for other people, and Jesus was like that. He cared for his friends. And once he'd got them clean, they had their meal. And at the end of the meal, Jesus stood up and he got a loaf of bread. And he said to them, this bread is just like my body, broken for you. And he broke the bread into pieces and he passed it around. And he told them that this bread was like his body, and he was giving it to them to help them remember him. He said, every time you break bread and share it together, remember me. Now that seemed like a slightly strange thing to do, but he did something else strange as well. He got a cup of wine. And he said, this cup of wine is like my blood. And every time you get together and you drink wine, remember me. And even to this day, Christians in churches around the world break bread and share wine to remember Jesus. But his friends didn't really understand it at the time. But they listened to what he was saying, and eventually the meal had finished, and Jesus went out with his friends, and they went out into a nearby garden. Now, when they got to the garden, disaster struck. Now, you remember a few days ago on the Palm Sunday, there had been people plotting against Jesus because they didn't like all the attention he was getting and the crowds cheering for him. And so they had some friends in very high places, and they came and they arrested Jesus. They chained him up and they took him off to see the governor, and the governor put him on trial. And now the governor couldn't find anything wrong with Jesus, but he was a bit scared of the crowds, because the crowds who just a few days before had been cheering hooray for Jesus were now cheering boo for Jesus. And they were cheering really loudly, and the governor was scared. So he handed Jesus over to the crowds, and the crowds shouted, crucify him, and crucifying was one of the ways that the Romans used to kill people. So that was a really serious thing to happen to Jesus. And so they took him and they marched him up a hill, and they put him on a cross. And this is why a cross is one of the symbols of Christianity, because Jesus was killed on a cross, high on a hill. And this was on the Friday morning. Now, we sometimes call this Good Friday, but I'm not sure that Jesus' friends thought it was a very good Friday. I wonder how you think they might have felt when they saw all of this happening. Jesus, who just a few days ago the crowds had been cheering for, now he was being killed. And so they killed him on a cross, and then later in the day, when he was dead, they took him down from the cross and they wrapped his body in a cloth, and they took him to a tomb, and they buried him in a tomb which was a bit like a cave. And then, to make sure that his body was safe and secure, they rolled a really big, heavy stone over the entrance to the tomb. And they all went home. Now, I wonder how you think his friends were feeling at this point. I think they would have been maybe a bit scared, maybe a bit sad, maybe a bit angry even. But on the Sunday morning, so remember that happened on the Friday, now the Saturday was the Sabbath day, which meant that they weren't allowed to do anything. On the Sunday morning, very, very early, they got up and they raced to the garden, to the graveyard where Jesus was buried, and they went to find his tomb. And when they got there, something strange had happened, because remember the big heavy stone that they'd rolled in front of the tomb? That had been rolled away, and the tomb was empty, and Jesus' body was nowhere to be seen. Now, they would have been really worried at this point, and they wondered what had happened. Maybe somebody had come and moved the body, or maybe something had happened. And Mary, who was one of Jesus' friends, she looked around and she saw the gardener pottering around tending to the daffodils or the roses or whatever it was in the graveyard. And she went to the gardener and she said, "Excuse me, do you know what's happened to my friend's body?" And the gardener looked at her and he said, "Mary." He called her by name, and she realised that this wasn't the gardener at all. This was Jesus. He'd come back to life again. And she ran and she told all of Jesus' other friends, and they came and they saw Jesus for themselves. And for the next few weeks, they all met with Jesus and they ate with him and they spent time with him. And that is the Easter story. And the point of the Easter story for Christians is that this empty tomb, where Jesus' body was laid and then where Jesus rose from the dead, the point of the story is that God's love, God's power is more powerful than anything in the world. So we all face sad things in our lives. We all have things that worry us or scare us or make us upset. But God's love is more powerful than any of those. And so that is the Easter story. That is what Christians celebrate at Easter. We celebrate that Jesus is alive and he is always with us. And whatever we're doing, however we're feeling, whatever we're going through, we can talk to him, we can share with him. And do you know what Christians call that? We call it praying. And so I'm going to finish with a prayer now. Dear God, we thank you for the Easter story, the story of how Jesus died and came back to life to show us that nothing can be more powerful than your love for us. Amen. So I hope that the rest of your day is a really good one, and I really look forward to seeing you in person soon, and we can have some more stories from the Bible, more stories about Jesus, and I can show you around our lovely church. Bye, everybody.